The weight of a full suit of armor pressing down on your shoulders, 50 pounds of steel in the blistering sun while enemies close in from all sides. This wasn't just a scene from a movie, it was daily life for medieval knights who stood at the heart of warfare, politics, and even romance. But behind the gleaming helmets and heroic legends lies a world of brutal training, shocking battlefield secrets, and rituals so strange they'll make you question everything you thought you knew. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the medieval era's most iconic figures, from the truth about their so-called chivalry to the gruesome realities of surviving a sword fight. These 30 facts will rewrite your understanding of knighthood. And trust us, by the end, you'll never look at a suit of armor the same way again. Forget the fairy tales of noble-born knights. Many of these warriors clawed their way up from the very bottom. The path to knighthood wasn't just a birthright for lords and princes. It was a grueling meritocracy where even a peasant's son could rise through sheer grit. Picture a young boy, barely 7 years old, handed off to a lord's household as a page. No silver spoon, no family crest, just the promise of endless chores and swordsmanship drills until his hands bled. This was how commoners began their unlikely journey toward the title of knight. Some proved themselves in battle, saving a lord's life or showing uncanny skill with a blade. Others climbed the ranks through decades of loyal service, trading sweat and blood for a shot at honor. The catch, even if they earned their spurs, many low-born knights still faced sneers from high-born nobles who saw them as upstarts. But that didn't stop legends like William Marshall, the landless younger son who became the greatest tournament knight of his era and later ruled England as regent. His story and countless others shatter the myth that knighthood was just for the aristocracy. Imagine being ripped from your family as a small child. No toys, no carefree games, just years of backbreaking labor and strict discipline. That was reality for young boys destined to become knights. At just 7 years old, they were shipped off to live in the castles of lords or wealthy knights, starting their journey as pages. Their days were filled with menial tasks, scrubbing armor, running errands, even waiting tables like servants. But between chores, they were drilled in the fundamentals of knighthood: how to ride a horse before they could barely climb into the saddle, how to handle a wooden practice sword nearly as tall as themselves. Failure wasn't an option. A single lapse in attention could mean a whipping or worse. By the time they turned 14, those who survived the harsh upbringing graduated to squires, personal assistants to seasoned knights. Now the real training began. Squires shadowed their masters day and night, not just in combat but in every aspect of aristocratic life. They learned to carve meat elegantly at feasts, recite poetry to impress noble ladies, and most crucially, tend to their knight's armor and weapons. A single speck of rust on a sword could mean disaster in battle, so squires polished every piece until it gleamed. They also trained relentlessly, sparring with blunted steel until their muscles screamed and their hands were raw with blisters. But the education of a knight wasn't just about brute strength or swordplay. They studied strategy, learning to read battlefields like chessboards. Some were even taught basic medicine, how to stitch wounds or set broken bones, skills that could save their own lives one day. And here's something surprising. Many squires learned to play musical instruments or compose verses. Why? Because a true knight was expected to be as refined in court as he was deadly in war. This grueling, all-encompassing training turned boys into warriors who could charge into battle with unwavering discipline, or charm a noblewoman's favor with a well-turned phrase. Here's the next segment of the script. The clash of steel in battle wasn't the only music a knight needed to know. While we picture them as warriors forged in combat, the ideal knight was also a patron of the arts, expected to strum a lute as skillfully as he swung a sword. Courts across Europe prized knights who could compose love poems, debate philosophy, or even perform intricate dances. This wasn't just about showing off. Mastering music and poetry was key to a knight's survival in the cutthroat world of nobility. A poorly sung ballad or clumsy conversation could cost him favor with a powerful lord, or worse, humiliate him in front of a lady he hoped to impress. Take the legendary knight and troubadour Ulrich von Liechtenstein, who once jousted in disguise, not for glory, but to prove his devotion through poetry and combat. Or consider the Chansons Digest, epic songs knights memorized to learn bravery, loyalty, and even diplomacy. These weren't hobbies, they were tools of the trade. A knight's reputation hinged as much on his wit and charm as his battlefield prowess. So why spend years learning verses when a sharp blade could solve most problems? Because chivalry wasn't just a code, it was a performance. The most successful knights knew violence alone couldn't win wars or secure alliances. They had to navigate royal courts like chessboards, where a well-turned phrase could be deadlier than a dagger. And speaking of weapons, let's slice through one of the biggest myths about their most iconic tool, the knightly sword. This segment introduces the cultural expectations of knights with vivid examples. Connects arts and combat as complementary skills, sets up the next topic, swords, smoothly without a jarring transition, avoids repetitive phrasing while maintaining energy. Balances education and entertainment for broad appeal. Let me know if you'd like any refinements. That gleaming longsword clutched in a knight's hand. It wasn't the hulking slab of metal movies would have you believe. While Hollywood loves showing heroes straining to lift massive broadswords, real medieval blades were feats of engineering, light enough to wield with one hand, yet lethal in the right grip. A masterfully forged longsword rarely tipped the scales beyond 4 pounds, some as light as 2. That's less than a bag of flour. Craftsmen spent weeks folding and hammering steel to strike the perfect balance. Enough weight to slice through armor gaps or deliver bone-crushing strikes, but nimble enough for rapid thrusts and parries. The tapered design concentrated force at the tip, letting knights exploit speed over brute strength. Historical fencing manuals revealed techniques so precise, fighters could target the gaps between an opponent's fingers or thread the needle of a visor's eye slit. So why the myth of unwieldy swords? Blame dramatized battle scenes and poorly weighted replicas. Real combat was less about slow, theatrical swings and more like a deadly dance. And if knights needed raw power, they'd switch to axes or maces. But that sleek longsword, it wasn't just a weapon, it was an extension of the knight's body, a testament to craftsmanship and centuries of refined skill. Now about that armor they were fighting against while their swords stayed light. The real burden came from the suits meant to stop those blades cold. That steel-plated silhouette charging across a battlefield wasn't just a medieval tank. It was a precision instrument, every hinge and curve tailored to its wearer's body. A full suit of plate armor might weigh as much as a child, but the real shock isn't the bulk. It's how little that weight slowed a trained knight. Contrary to Hollywood's clunky portrayals, these warriors could sprint, vault onto horses, even perform cartwheels in their custom-fitted steel. The secret: weight distribution. Instead of burdening the shoulders alone, armor dispersed pressure across the body, like a well-designed hiking backpack. But mobility came at a cost no movie shows: the suffocating heat inside that metal shell. Imagine wearing a sauna in mid-July while dodging battle axes. Knights soaked their linen undershirts in sweat within minutes, and dehydration could drop them faster than an enemy blade. Some drilled ventilation holes in visors or opted for lighter chainmail in summer campaigns. Yet nothing could spare them from the stench of weeks on campaign without bathing, which brings us to a battle even armor couldn't shield them from: the war on Grime. While we picture gleaming knights, the reality was far messier. Rust wasn't their only hygiene headache. Fleas nested in padded gambesons, lice-infested hair they rarely washed, and cleaning armor often meant just wiping off blood with a dirty rag. Forget pristine castles, these warriors lived in a world where clean meant not visibly filthy. Next time you see a shiny suit in a museum, remember, behind every polished breastplate was a man who probably smelled like old leather and last week's battle. If you think modern deodorant commercials exaggerate, you've never smelled a medieval knight's armpits after a month-long campaign. Forget daily showers, clean water was often considered dangerous, believed to spread disease by opening pores to bad air. Instead of bathing, knights relied on linen undershirts to wick away sweat, changing them regularly while leaving their skin untouched. The result, a lingering funk so potent it could knock a squire off his feet. But they weren't oblivious to the problem. Perfumes became a knight's secret weapon, blending crushed roses, lavender, and exotic spices into pomanders worn around the neck. Wealthy knights even soaked their armor linings in fragrant resins like myrrh to mask the reek of unwashed skin and vinegar-soaked steel. Some went further, carrying sweet bags of dried herbs to sniff when the stench of crowded halls became unbearable. And then there were the pre-battle rituals, equal parts superstition and survival. Before charging into combat, many knights would dab their armor with aromatic oils, not just for fragrance but as a spiritual cleanse. Others tucked relics or prayer scrolls into their gauntlets, believing divine favor mattered as much as sword skill. One French knight insisted on wearing the same moth-eaten undershirt to every battle for good luck, despite its eye-watering aroma. The irony, while they avoided water like plague, these warriors would ritually wash their hands before feasts not for hygiene, but because dirty fingers offended noble etiquette. Priorities, it seems, were as layered as their armor. The night before battle, superstitions ruled a knight's world as powerfully as steel. While skill and strategy decided the fight, many warriors believed unseen forces tipped the scales, and they weren't taking chances. Some slept with their swords to absorb mystical energy from the moonlight, whispering prayers into the blade's edge. Others tucked dried, toed bones into their helmets or wore tunics stitched with cryptic symbols, convinced these talismans could deflect arrows just as well as armor. Diet played a bizarre role too. Certain foods were strictly forbidden before combat. No eggs, they symbolized fragility. No chicken, cowardice, and absolutely no cheese. Some claimed it slowed reflexes. In contrast, garlic became a battlefield staple, thought to ward off not just vampires but bad luck in general. One French chronicle tells of a knight who refused to fight until his squire found him a specific type of red apple, believing its color mirrored the blood he hoped to spill. But rituals took a darker turn after defeat. A knight who lost despite his charms faced more than humiliation. His very weapons might be punished. Blades that failed their masters were sometimes dragged through dirt or struck against stones to shame them. In extreme cases, swords were bent into uselessness and abandoned at crossroads as offerings to wandering spirits. These weren't mere tantrums, they were acts of desperate bargaining with forces beyond human control. And here's the twist: for all their superstitions, knights knew luck alone couldn't save them. After kissing their lucky charms and tightening their blessed belts, they still marched into battle with meticulously maintained gear and years of training. The difference between faith and folly, one gave them courage, the other a backup plan. The battlefield wasn't just a stage for heroics, it was a high-stakes marketplace where living knights meant cold, hard cash. While movies glorify fatal duels, the truth is far more calculating. A dead noble brought little beyond bragging rights, but a captured one, that was a lottery win. Ransoming wealthy prisoners became such a lucrative trade that knights often fought less lethally, targeting joints and weak points to disable, not kill. A single highborn captive could demand sums equal to years of a lord's income, enough to buy land, fund armies, or secure political favors. Take the infamous capture of King Jean Roman II of France at Poitiers in 1356. His English captors held him for a staggering ransom of 3 million gold crowns, over $500 million in today's currency, negotiated over 4 years of comfortable imprisonment. Even lesser knights fetched hefty prices, with payments often spread in installments like a medieval mortgage. Fail to pay, expect humiliation. One German knight was paraded around towns in his underwear until his family scraped together the funds. But this mercenary mindset had unintended consequences. Since ransoms spared the elite, common soldiers bore the brunt of battlefield slaughter, while nobles enjoyed relative safety. It also birthed shady practices. Some knights accidentally killed rivals to settle personal feuds, disguising murder as battlefield chaos. Yet amid the cutthroat deals, an odd honor code emerged. Captors treated high-value prisoners like guests, housing them in lavish quarters and even taking them hunting. After all, a miserable captive might refuse to pay, or worse, escape before the money arrived. So what did knights do between these high-profit battles? Their downtime might surprise you. Between the roaring crowds and fluttering banners, medieval tournaments hid a grim truth. These spectacles of supposed mock combat often proved more lethal than actual wars. While battles had strategic retreats and ransom incentives to keep nobles alive, tournaments were outright slaughterhouses where knights fought with blunted weapons but full-force blows. The famed melee events, mass brawls with hundreds of armored men, descended into chaotic bloodbaths with crushing falls, trampling war horses, and opportunistic vendettas disguised as accidents. Why gamble with death for sport? The rewards outweighed the risks. A single victorious joust could earn a knight riches rivaling a year's plunder, not to mention priceless political favor. One German chronicle describes a knight winning enough silver to buy a small castle after unseating 3 opponents in an afternoon, but losers faced more than bruised egos. Disgraced knights sometimes fled tournaments under fake names, like one French competitor who bolted after defeat, leaving behind his shield painted with borrowed heraldry to avoid shaming his family. Yet even in this brutality, rules emerged. Striking a fallen opponent was forbidden, and specially appointed heralds of arms policed fouls, though enforcement was spotty when tempers flared. Some knights sewed hidden strips of armor under their tunics, while others poisoned lance tips in secret. The line between honor and treachery blurred with every splintered spear. And behind the violence lay an unspoken truth. Tournaments were the medieval equivalent of job interviews. Impress the right lord, and you might land a lifetime appointment as a household knight. Fail too often, you'd be left scrambling for mercenary work. For knights, glory wasn't just about fame, it was their resume in steel and blood. This desperate dance of risk and reward reveals a deeper paradox. The same warriors who revered chivalry's code could abandon it the moment a golden prize glittered in the stands. So how did they reconcile these contradictions? The answer lies in a clandestine system of rituals, ones that governed everything from battlefield surrenders to the proper way to insult an enemy. The code of chivalry might have looked pristine in storybooks, but the reality was far muddier, like a bloodstain on a silk tabard. For every knight who rescued damsels and honored truces, there were a dozen who torched peasant homes, extorted merchants, or abandoned allies when the fighting turned dire. Chroniclers wrote of noble warriors, but court records tell a different tale. Knights caught stealing church relics, slaughtering surrendering foes, or even selling captured comrades to the highest bidder. Take the infamous Chevauché raids, knight-led campaigns designed not to conquer land, but to cripple enemies by burning crops, poisoning wells, and terrorizing civilians. One English knight boasted in his memoirs of leaving smoke from horizon to horizon during a French campaign, while a German mercenary group known as the Huntsfort earned their nickname Son of a Dog for raiding their own allies' villages. Even sacred oaths crumbled under ambition. The Knights Templars swore vows of poverty, yet their Paris treasury became Europe's de facto bank. Some Teutonic knights carved out personal fiefdoms in Prussia, ruling like tyrants over locals they were meant to convert peacefully. The truth, chivalry wasn't a rulebook. It was a PR campaign, polished in ballads but often abandoned when gold or survival hung in the balance. And if knights could betray their own kind, imagine how they treated their most vital companions, their war horses. These animals weren't pets, they were living weapons, bred for violence and often pushed beyond their limits. A knight might praise his stallion in poems, but on the march, that same horse could be starved to save rations or ridden to collapse in muddy battlefields. Next time you see a painting of a knight on horseback, remember, the steed beneath him likely suffered as much as the peasants in his path. A knight's warhorse wasn't just a mode of transport, it was a four-legged fortune on the battlefield, bred for strength, speed, and an almost eerie obedience amid chaos. These destriers were the Ferraris of their day, with price tags to match. Records from 13th century France show a single elite warhorse could cost up to 800 livres, enough to buy a small village or outfit an entire infantry unit. Losing one in combat wasn't just a setback, it could bankrupt a knight overnight. But the real surprise, what kept these beasts in fighting shape? Forget wild oats or simple hay, warhorses dined like athletes. Their diets included protein-rich beans, crushed grain mixed with eggs, even the occasional sip of beer for energy. Some knights added honey to their horses' feed for stamina, while others swore by secret recipes with herbs like vervain to calm nerves before charges. The most pampered steeds ate from silver troughs in lords' stables, their coats brushed with wine vinegar to repel parasites. This wasn't mere indulgence. A malnourished horse meant certain death in battle, one stumble mid-charge, and a knight's expensive armor became a steel coffin. Manuscripts show knights whispering prayers over their mounts before combat, offering them treats from their own hands. The bond ran so deep that when a favored warhorse died, some warriors retired its horseshoes as relics or buried them with military honors. Yet beneath this care lay a brutal irony. While knights mourned their steeds, the same compassion rarely extended to the peasants who grew that costly grain. A single horse's meal could feed a family for weeks, proof that in the medieval world, even loyalty had its limits. And speaking of limits, there's a stomach-churning twist to what kept these warriors fueled on campaign behind the image of lavish feasts and overflowing goblets. A knight's diet swung between extremes, one day dining like a king, the next gnawing on boiled leather for survival. While castles stocked salted meats, aged cheeses, and imported spices for peacetime banquets, war stripped away all pretenses of luxury. Forget the Hollywood scenes of knights feasting in campaign tents. On the march, meals were whatever could be scavenged or carried without spoiling. Hardtack biscuits so dense they could crack teeth became staples, washed down with vinegar-spiked water to hide the taste of algae from stagnant ponds. Yet when provisions ran low, rank meant nothing. During the brutal siege of Château-Gaillard in 1204, French defenders reportedly ate their horses, then rats, then finally the glue from their own shield bindings. Even royalty suffered. Richard the Lionheart once survived for days on nothing but rancid bacon and rainwater during a siege. The irony, those same knights who prided themselves on enduring hunger would later gorge at victory feasts until they vomited, only to start eating again. The real secret to their endurance wasn't some ancient superfood, it was pragmatism. Knights carried portable pocket kitchens, foldable metal grills, dried peas, and strips of salted beef sewn into their saddlebags. Some even wore garlic necklaces, not for superstition but as emergency rations, and when times got truly desperate, they'd drink their own horse's blood, a grim last resort that kept them fighting when weaker men collapsed. But one delicacy was always worth the risk: stolen wine. Raiding an enemy's cellar could turn the tide of morale, even if the barrels had turned to vinegar. After all, a knight with a full stomach, or at least a numb tongue, fought harder than one counting his ribs. That iconic image of a knight lumbering awkwardly in his armor. Pure Hollywood fantasy. In reality, a properly fitted suit of steel functioned like a second skin, flexible enough for acrobatics, yet sturdy enough to deflect blades. Trained warriors could mount horses without assistance, haul themselves over castle walls, even swim short distances while armored. Records from 15th century tournaments describe competitors executing backflips in full plate to entertain crowds, hardly the movements of clumsy tin cans. But here's the catch: no reenactment shows going to the bathroom. Once sealed into that metal shell, answering nature's call became a logistical nightmare. Most suits had no clever access panels, forcing knights to either endure crippling discomfort or rely on humiliating workarounds. Some wore specially designed leather tubes beneath their armor, while others simply let nature take its course, stewing in their own filth until a squire could pry them free. The wealthiest lords might retreat behind privacy screens during lengthy ceremonies, where attendants would hastily unbolt sections of their armor like mechanics servicing a stalled carriage. This absurd vulnerability humanizes these seemingly invincible warriors. For all their battlefield prowess, they still wrestled with the same basic needs as any peasant, just with far more awkward consequences. And if you think that's undignified, wait until you hear how they handled injuries mid-combat. That famous painting of a knight effortlessly leaping onto his steed. Pure artistic license. While armor gave warriors incredible mobility once seated, mounting a warhorse in full plate was a two-man job at best, or a three-man comedy routine at worst. A fully armored knight weighed more than a modern firefighter's gear, and without a mounting block or a sturdy squire's shoulder to step on, he'd be left hopping awkwardly like a penguin in a metal onesie. But the real terror wasn't the struggle to climb up. It was the catastrophic possibility of toppling over mid-battle. Imagine being suitcased in steel, hitting the ground like a dropped anvil. Contrary to myths, knights could rise without a crane's help, but it required a brutal technique, rolling onto their stomachs, bracing their sword like a kickstand, and heaving themselves up in stages, often while enemies circled like wolves. Some carried daggers just to jab into the dirt as leverage. The smartest warriors had contingency plans etched into their armor's design. Articulated knee joints allowed them to kneel for stability, while fluted plating let them rock onto their sides. A few even wore grooved sabatons, those pointy foot covers specifically to catch on terrain for self-righting, yet nothing could erase the humiliation. Chronicles describe unhorsed knights bargaining with foot soldiers to help them up mid-combat, offering gold or favors. One account from the Battle of Agincourt tells of an English squire who charged enemy lines not to fight, but to flip his stranded master upright like a tortoise. This vulnerability reveals a truth no ballad mentions. For all their elite status, knights depended on teamwork as much as strength. Their greatest weapon wasn't a sword, it was the squire, stable hand, or even lowly infantryman who kept them from becoming a glittering pancake on the battlefield. And if you think that's an undignified downfall, wait until you learn what happened when nature called during a 6-hour siege. That gleaming suit of armor didn't just make knights walking targets when they fell, it turned them into high-value loot boxes for opportunistic enemies. While Hollywood paints battlefields as chaotic free-for-alls, medieval combat had ruthless economy. A grounded knight was a paycheck waiting to be collected. Foot soldiers swarmed fallen warriors like ants on honey, not to deliver mercy kills, but to strip them of anything valuable before dragging them off for ransom. The real danger wasn't just the inability to stand, it was the suffocating weight of their own protection. Pinned face down, a knight's visor could become a dirt funnel with every gasped breath. Some suffocated in mud before blades ever reached them, their last moments spent drowning in the very earth they fought to control. This explains why battlefield tactics often focused on unhorsing opponents first. Once toppled, even the mightiest knight became as helpless as a turtle on its back. But the darkest twist, their vulnerability bred a shadow industry of battlefield thieves. Peasant levies, poorly armed and rarely paid, learned to swarm fallen knights like medieval pickpockets, slicing through armor straps to steal gauntlets, belts, even gold-filled teeth before the fighting had ended. Chroniclers tell of knights waking from unconsciousness to find themselves barefoot in their underclothes, their armor already sold off in some blacksmith's backroom. This grim reality forced knights into uncomfortable alliances with common soldiers they'd otherwise scorn. A single loyal spearman could mean the difference between being hauled to safety or left as scrap metal on the field. Yet for all their battlefield woes, nothing compared to the crimes some knights committed when they were the predators. When the wars ended and the tournaments dried up, not every knight returned to a life of noble comforts, some simply turned to highway robbery. These weren't peasant thieves skulking in the shadows, but armored predators who exploited their training and status to terrorize roads with impunity. Without a lord's payroll or the spoils of battle, so-called knights errant often became little more than glorified bandits, ambushing merchants and pilgrims under the thin guise of toll collecting. The law should have crushed them, except justice worked differently for men of noble blood. While peasants caught stealing faced hanging, a knight caught red-handed might get a slap on the wrist, a fine, temporary exile, or at worst, a symbolic knight in the stocks. Their armor and lineage acted as a shield, making authorities reluctant to hang someone who could theoretically be useful in the next war. One chronicle from Burgundy describes a knight who robbed the same trade route 17 times before finally being imprisoned, not for theft, but because he'd embarrassed a local count by outpacing his own tax collectors. Even punishments carried a twisted privilege. Disgraced knights might be sentenced to crusades as penance, turning holy wars into dumping grounds for violent delinquents. Others received poetic justice, forced to wear degrading armor painted with mocking symbols, like one French brigand who had to don a helmet shaped like a rooster's comb for his cowardly attacks on the defenseless. Yet the darkest irony, many of these outlaw knights weren't desperate, they were calculating. Some operated like medieval mafias, charging villagers protection fees against the very raids they orchestrated. In Germany, robber knights even built illegal castles along trade routes, essentially running extortion rackets with drawbridges. Their victims had no recourse. Appealing to the nobility meant appealing to the thieves' own cousins and former comrades in arms. This lawless underworld reveals a bitter truth. Chivalry's code bent easily when gold outweighed honor, and for every knight turned, bandit swinging from a gibbet, a dozen more slipped back into respectable society when the next war trumpets blew, proving that in the Middle Ages, crime didn't always pay unless you wore spurs. Fact 17. Love, law, and lethal duels. When romance demanded bloodshed behind the pageantry of courtly love lay a brutal reality. A knight's love life could literally become a matter of life and death. While poets spun tales of chivalrous devotion, real knights often settled romantic disputes with steel instead of sonnets. The infamous trial by combat wasn't reserved for treason or theft. It could be invoked over a whispered insult, a stolen kiss, or even a rival's claim to a lady's favor. Take the bizarre case of Jean de Carouze in 14th century France. After accusing a squire of assaulting his wife, he wasn't content with a courtroom verdict. Instead, he demanded a duel to the death, convinced God would grant victory to the truthful party. The fight, watched by thousands, ended with Decarus driving his sword through his opponent's throat, proving his wife's virtue in the messiest possible way. But these duels weren't just about justice, they were public spectacles of masculinity. Combatants wore their ladies' colors like modern athletes sporting team jerseys, and victory could catapult a knight to celebrity status. Lose, however, and the consequences were dire. A slain knight's body was often denied Christian burial, his name dragged through the mud as a perjurer. The irony, many of these fights hinged on accusations neither side could prove, like infidelity or broken betrothals. Yet the church openly endorsed the practice, believing divine intervention would favor the innocent. In one German trial, a knight won by tripping over his own cloak mid-duel. The stumble was hailed as a miracle, confirming his opponent's guilt. This lethal theater reveals a dark side of medieval romance. Where modern suitors might exchange texts or gifts, knights gambled their lives to win a lady's hand or salvage their pride. And if you think that's dramatic, wait until you hear how they handled rejection. Fact 18. Forbidden whispers. When a knight's love letter could be a death warrant, the troubadours sang of stolen glances and secret trysts. But for knights, pursuing a noblewoman wasn't just risky, it was political dynamite. Behind the flowery poetry of courtly love lay a world where a single misplaced sigh could cost a knight his title, his lands, or even his head. Noble marriages were strategic alliances brokered like treaties between kingdoms. A knight caught flirting with a lord's wife or daughter wasn't just insulting her honor, he was threatening entire bloodlines, yet human hearts rarely obey decrees. Knights and ladies devised elaborate codes to skirt the rules. Handkerchiefs dropped accidentally, favors woven into banners with hidden meanings, even songs where every lyric carried double entendres. One chronicle describes a knight who trained his dog to carry love notes in its collar, while another left messages scratched into the wax of chapel candles. The stakes: a German knight in the 12th century was castrated and exiled for serenading a duke's betrothed, while an English lord famously hanged a rival from his own castle gates for sending his wife a lock of hair. The cruelest twist: some of these affairs were openly tolerated as long as they stayed discreet. Queens and countesses wielded romantic attention as political currency, rewarding loyal knights with flirtations that boosted their status at court. But cross the invisible line from charming admirer to potential threat, and the same hands that once bestowed silk favors could sign death warrants. Which raises a chilling question: how many knights risked everything for love only to meet their end not in battle, but in a lord's dungeon? The answer lies in a number far harder to romanticize: their shockingly short lifespans. Fact 19. The death clock behind the shining armor. Why most knights didn't see 40, that noble face beneath the helmet. Statistically, it belonged to a dead man walking. While legends paint knights as timeless heroes, the brutal truth is most never celebrated their 40th birthday. Between battlefield butchery, festering wounds, and the so-called sport of tournaments, their careers were often shorter than a squire's apprenticeship. Consider the numbers. Medieval chronicles from England and France suggest over half of all knights died violently before 35. Even in peacetime, a single infected splinter from a tournament lance could spell an agonizing end. Records from the Teutonic Order show knights dropping like flies from dysentery during Baltic campaigns, far more than from actual combat. And if disease didn't claim them, their own gear might. One German knight suffocated inside his helmet after the visor jammed shut during a summer march. Yet this fleeting existence only amplified their obsession with legacy. Knowing death loomed, knights commissioned elaborate tombs years in advance, some even posing for their own effigies while still alive. Others founded monasteries or donated stolen war loot to churches, hedging their bets for the afterlife. The most cunning left behind fabricated chronicles, paying scribes to inflate their exploits into immortality. The irony, while individual knights burned out fast, their cultural impact endured for centuries. Their codes shaped modern law, their armor revolutionized metallurgy, and their bloodlines, often exaggerated, still echo in aristocratic families today. For men who rarely outlived a medieval horse, that's not a bad return on investment. And speaking of investments, there's a filthy secret behind how they funded those legacies. Fact 20. The shot that shattered 1,000 years of steel, how gunpowder doomed the knight, but immortalized the legend. A single puff of smoke from a crude hand cannon changed warfare forever and spelled the beginning of the end for armored knights. By the late 14th century, gunpowder weapons began piercing even the finest plate armor at 100 paces, turning battlefields into shooting galleries where a common foot soldier with a musket could drop a nobleman who'd trained his whole life for combat. The writing was on the wall, or rather, punched straight through it by a cannonball. Yet in a twist of irony, the very weapons that made knights obsolete also cemented their legend. As their military relevance faded, their cultural grip tightened. Poets and chroniclers, perhaps mourning the loss of an era, spun ever grander tales of chivalry, now sanitized of its grittier truths. The same lords who'd once bankrupted themselves funding armor upgrades suddenly poured gold into tapestries and ballads, rewriting history to portray knights as stainless heroes rather than the brutal, pragmatic warriors they'd truly been. The transition wasn't immediate. Some knights stubbornly clung to tradition, like the French heavy cavalry at the Battle of Pavia in 1525, who charged Spanish arquebusiers head-on. Only to be mowed down in minutes, others adapted, swapping lances for pistols and trading plate armor for buff coats that could deflect bullets barely. But the message was clear. The age of individual valor was over, replaced by volleys of lead fired in unison. Gunpowder didn't just kill knights, it embalmed them in myth. Their actual battles had been messy, inglorious affairs, but now their stories were polished into parables of honor. Even as real knights faded into ceremonial roles or became glorified tax collectors, their fictional counterparts grew larger than life. It's no accident that Cervantes wrote Don Quixote just as the last armored cavalry units were disbanding, a eulogy for an era already slipping into fantasy. The ultimate paradox, the knights' decline made them immortal. Stripped of their battlefield function, they became symbols, their armor transformed from practical gear to museum pieces, and their legends weaponized for new wars of propaganda and nostalgia. Call it history's greatest rebranding campaign. The knight died so the myth could live forever. Fact 21. The Reinvention of Knighthood. How legends whitewashed history's brutal warriors. Long after the last armored charge, knights underwent something far stranger than retirement. They were reborn as saints. The same men who once burned villages for profit became paragons of virtue in storybooks, their sins scrubbed cleaner than a polished breastplate. Take King Arthur's Round Table, a fictional brotherhood where knights quested for holy relics rather than ransom gold, and loyalty never faltered unless you peek at older Welsh legends showing Arthur's men slaughtering monks over cattle raids. This romanticizing wasn't accidental. As Europe industrialized, nobles desperate to cling to relevance funded troubadours to spin tales of a golden age of chivalry. Poets like Chrétien de Troyes transformed historical warlords like Godfrey of Bouillon into pious crusaders, ignoring his troops' sack of Jerusalem where blood reached horses' bridles. Even the Knights Templar, disbanded for corruption, got a posthumous PR makeover as tragic guardians of Christendom. But the most telling twist, these myths crossed borders effortlessly. Japan's samurai, equally complex figures who practiced both Zen philosophy and peasant repression, were similarly polished into Bushido ideals centuries after their demise. The Ottoman Sipahi, mounted warriors who blended mercenary pragmatism with religious fervor, became romantic symbols of Turkish honor. Every culture that once feared armored horsemen later dressed them in metaphorical halos. Why this global nostalgia? Perhaps because the truth was too messy for national myths. Societies needed simplified heroes, flawless icons to contrast with their own crumbling morals. The real knights, meanwhile, molded in forgotten ledgers, tax records listing stolen grain, court rolls detailing drunken brawls, and faded ransom notes haggling over human lives. Their greatest feat wasn't winning battles, but convincing posterity they'd never fought dirty in the first place. And if you think Europe's knights were unique, wait until you meet their worldwide counterparts, warriors who prove armor and ambition wore the same face across continents. Fact 22. The knight's secret edge. Why Europe's warriors ruled the battlefield differently from Japan's katana-wielding samurai to the Middle East's elite Furusilla cavalry. Nearly every culture had its own version of the armored warrior elite. But European knights developed one brutal advantage their global counterparts never matched: the couched lance charge. While other horseback fighters relied on archery or slashing swords, knights perfected the art of turning their warhorses into living battering rams. Picture 800 pounds of muscle and steel hurtling forward at 30 miles per hour, a 12-foot lance leveled like a javelin, impact force strong enough to punch through castle gates. This wasn't just a tactic, it was physics harnessed for destruction. Unlike samurai spears designed for precision thrusts or Arab cavalry's hit-and-run skirmishes, the European lance became a one-shot kill weapon. When a knight's armored knee locked into the saddle's high cantle and his steel-clad feet braced in stirrups, his entire body transformed into a single shock-absorbing unit. The result, a collision so devastating, chroniclers compared it to a thunderbolt from God's own hand. At the Battle of Hastings in 1066, Norman knights used this technique to skewer Saxon shield walls like parchment. Yet the technique came with a catch. Unlike samurai who could draw and strike in seconds, a knight's charge demanded perfect timing, open terrain, and most crucially expensive warhorses bred for nerve. While a Furusilla horseman might ride smaller, agile steeds suited for desert raids, knights needed colossal destriers trained not to flinch at the crash of steel. One misfired charge at Agincourt left French knights floundering in mud, their lances useless against English longbows. The legacy of this innovation outlasted the knights themselves. Modern tank warfare still uses the term shock and awe, a direct descendant of that moment when a line of lances dipped in unison, heralding a storm of hoofbeats and shattered bone. For all their shared ideals of honor, Europe's knights found their edge not in philosophy, but in the calculated terror of momentum meeting metal. And if you think that's where the global parallels end, wait until you see how differently these warrior cultures faced their twilight. Fact 23. The forbidden gold. Why spurs were more valuable than swords. Those gleaming gold spurs weren't just flashy accessories, they were a knight's legal ID, protected by laws as strict as modern copyright. In a world where armor could be stolen and titles forged, spurs acted as the ultimate status symbol. Only an ordained knight had the right to wear them, and any commoner caught strapping on a pair faced punishments ranging from public flogging to having their hands chopped off. Even wealth couldn't buy this privilege. When a rich Italian merchant once strutted into court with gilded spurs, he was dragged outside and forced to lick them clean in front of the laughing nobility. But the real power of these spurs lay in their ceremonial role. During the dubbing ritual, a squire's silver spurs were literally hacked off his boots and replaced with gold, a visceral metaphor for shedding his old life. Lose them in disgrace, and the humiliation was equally theatrical. Dishonored knights had their spurs ceremonially broken or dragged behind a horse through town, their clinking demise announcing their fall from grace louder than any herald's trumpet. And here's the twist: while swords could be lost or stolen, spurs were personal. They were adjusted to a knight's unique riding stance, molded to his heels like fingerprints. That's why battlefields became frenzied scavenger hunts after clashes, not for armor or weapons, but for those telltale glints of gold in the mud. Find a dead knight's spurs, and you just uncovered proof of a kill worthy of boasting rights or a swift promotion. Yet for all their prestige, these sacred symbols couldn't shield knights from their own darkest scandals. When one of their own broke the code, the punishments were as creative as they were cruel. Fact 24. The fall from grace. When dishonored knights became the court's punchline, a disgraced knight didn't just lose his title, he endured a spectacle designed to sear humiliation into memory. Medieval justice had a flair for drama, and nothing showcased that better than the degradation ceremony, a ritual so brutal it turned shame into theater. Picture this: a once respected warrior standing barefoot in the town square as a herald recited his crimes: cowardice, theft, betrayal. Then came the symbolic undoing of his very identity. His spurs were hacked off with a woodsman's axe. His shield, painted with proud heraldry, was dragged through dung before being splintered into kindling. Sometimes his armor was literally inverted, dangling from a gibbet like a hollowed-out carcass. But the cruelty didn't stop at props. Crowds pelted the condemned with rotten food, while minstrels composed mocking ballads on the spot. In one infamous case from Burgundy, a knight who'd fled battle was forced to wear a cloak of shame stitched with chickens, the ultimate jab at his courage. The message was clear: knighthood wasn't just revoked, it was erased. Yet behind these theatrical punishments lay a loophole as wide as a castle gate: exile. Many disgraced knights simply slipped across borders, selling their skills to foreign lords who cared little about past scandals. A French knight condemned for pillaging churches might resurface in Sicily leading mercenaries, his past conveniently forgotten. Others joined outlaw bands, turning their training against the very societies that spurned them. This paradox reveals the era's twisted pragmatism. For all the grandstanding about honor, kingdoms still needed killers, even tarnished ones. And sometimes those exiled knights returned with a vengeance. Fact 25. The lifeline behind the armor. How squires kept knights alive. Behind every legendary knight stood an unsung hero, their squire. These young men weren't just glorified assistants. They were battlefield medics, armory experts, and tactical lifelines rolled into one. While knights basked in glory, squires worked in the shadows, tightening straps before charges, sharpening blades between skirmishes, and even stitching wounds during combat. Forget Hollywood's lone warriors. Real knights were only as deadly as the squire at their back. Take the chaos of a medieval melee. A knight might fight for hours with a dented helmet blocking his vision or a loosened gauntlet compromising his grip. Enter the squire, darting through the fray with a hammer to bang out dents, a needle to sew torn armor padding, or a wineskin to flush dirt from a bleeding wound. Some carried makeshift tongs to yank arrows from their master's limbs mid-battle, knowing infection could set in before the fighting even ended. But their most critical role. Their armor reset. After each clash, squires would rapidly inspect every hinge and strap. A single missed buckle could prove fatal in the next engagement. Historical manuals describe squires using hook tools to realign bent breastplates or pine resin to temporarily seal cracked visors. And if a knight went down, it was often the squire who dragged him to safety, dodging arrows to haul hundreds of pounds of steel and unconscious nobility out of the kill zone. The brutal truth: knights without squires didn't last long. Records from the 100 Years' War show dismounted knights being captured at twice the rate when separated from their attendants. Some even carried emergency whistles to summon squires through the din of battle, a medieval version of calling for backup. Yet for all their importance, squires rarely got the credit. Their names vanished beneath their masters' legends, their labor reduced to footnotes in chronicles. Perhaps that's why one 15th century squire scribbled this bitter margin note in a training manual. "The knight rides on my sweat, but history rides on his name." Speaking of overlooked details, there's a hidden quirk in knights' helmets that changed warfare forever, that steel-clad knight staring you down through the slits of his visor. His helmet wasn't just protective gear, it was psychological warfare. While basic designs focused on deflecting blows, the most advanced helmets incorporated ingenious features that blurred the line between utility and terror. Some visors hinged upward like a drawbridge for better visibility during marches, while others locked shut with intricate mechanisms to prevent unlucky accidents mid-battle. But the real innovation lay in their customization. Wealthy knights commissioned visors shaped like snarling beasts or stern saints, transforming their faces into moving sculptures. The infamous frog-mouth jousting helm angled downward to deflect lances while making the wearer appear eerily inhuman, and those legendary horned helmets. They existed but more for ceremonial parades than combat, where protruding decorations could catch enemy weapons like a deadly handle. Yet one accessory proved disastrous: decorative plumes. Those dramatic horsehair crests swaying atop helmets weren't just vanity, they acted as deadly homing beacons. In the thick of battle, a vibrant plume made knights instant targets for archers. At the Battle of Crécy, French knights learned this the hard way when English longbowmen picked off their leaders by aiming for the tallest, most ornate feathers. Afterward, savvy commanders ordered crests removed, proving that sometimes survival trumped spectacle. These evolving designs reveal a constant arms race between protection and practicality. A knight's helmet had to balance intimidation with invisibility, individuality with survival, a metallic metaphor for the contradictions of knighthood itself. And if you think that was a delicate balancing act, wait until you hear about their most unpredictable enemies. Those gleaming gauntlets weren't just armored mittens, they were sneakily lethal tools hiding in plain sight. While most attention went to swords and lances, a knight's gloves often bore razor-sharp edges along the fingers and cuffs, turning every backhanded swipe into a potential killing stroke. Grapple with one in close combat, and you might not even feel the slice until your fingers hit the ground. Some designs even featured articulating spikes that extended like cat's claws when the fist clenched, perfect for hooking an opponent's visor or shredding exposed skin. But the true terror of these unassuming weapons wasn't their craftsmanship, it was how they exposed the hypocrisy of chivalry. Knights swore oaths to protect the weak, yet their deadliest gloves were often tested not on rival warriors, but on the very peasants they were supposed to defend. When rebellions erupted or villages resisted noble tax collectors, armored fists became instruments of brutal suppression. Chronicles from the German Peasants' War describe knights deliberately using their gauntlets' edges to maim rather than kill, leaving unarmed farmers with grotesque facial scars as grim reminders of their place in the feudal order. The irony, those same peasants were the ones who'd forged the steel, stitched the gloves' linings, and harvested the flax for their padding. A knight's hand might be clad in gilded violence, but it was calloused commoner hands that made that violence possible. And when those hands finally rose up, even the sharpest gauntlets couldn't stop history's pendulum from swinging back. Fact 28. When the plough overcame the sword, how peasant revolts exposed knights' greatest fear for all their armor and training. Knights trembled before an enemy they couldn't impale on a lance, the enraged peasant with nothing left to lose. The Jacquerie Revolt of 1358 wasn't just a riot, it was a slaughterhouse where farmers wielded pitchforks like pikes, burning castles and executing nobles with the same brutality they'd endured for generations. Chronicles describe knights dragged from their horses and hacked apart with scythes, their bodies left in ditches like common criminals. This wasn't an isolated incident. From England's peasants' revolt to the German Bundschuh uprisings, armored elites faced a nightmare scenario, outnumbered by foes who fought without rules. Peasant armies used terrain knights couldn't navigate flooded fields to bog down war horses, forest ambushes where polearms outmaneuvered swords. Even victory came at a cost. After crushing the Jacquerie, French knights imposed such grotesque punishments, rebels were forced to eat their own roasted leader, that it fueled further hatred. The deeper terror, these revolts proved chivalry's fatal flaw. Knights were trained to fight each other, not desperate mobs fighting for survival. When a starving farmer with a sharpened hoe could gut a nobleman through his visor's eye slit, the entire feudal hierarchy suddenly felt shockingly fragile. Yet amid this bloodshed, one group of knights clung to a different vow, one not of violence but divine surrender. Their story begins not on the battlefield but in the quiet of a cloister. Here's your next segment. Amid the bloodshed and plunder of the medieval world, an unlikely breed of warrior emerged, men who knelt in prayer by dawn and charged into battle by noon. The Knights Templar and Hospitaller weren't just soldiers. They were monks sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience, yet wielded swords with the precision of seasoned killers. Picture a man clad in a white mantle emblazoned with a red cross, his hands equally adept at clutching a rosary or driving a lance through an enemy's ribs. These weren't contradictions in their eyes, but sacred duty. Founded to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land, these warrior monks blurred every line between piety and violence. They slept in austere dormitories where weapons hung beside crucifixes, fasted on meager rations even while guarding wagon loads of Crusader gold, and took vows of silence broken only by battlefield commands. Their rulebooks read like bizarre fusions of monastic discipline and military manuals. One chapter dictated the correct way to chant psalms, the next explained how to disembowel an infidel without breaking formation. Yet for all their holy vows, their downfall was straight out of a political thriller. When the Templars grew too rich and powerful, King Philip Roman IV of France orchestrated their destruction with chilling efficiency. Arrested on trumped-up charges of heresy and sacrilege, knights who'd once been Christendom's elite were tortured into confessing absurd crimes, worshipping demonic idols, spitting on the cross. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, was burned alive in Paris, his ashes scattered to erase even the memory of his order. The bitter irony, these monks turned mercenaries died not for their sins on the battlefield, but for the sin of becoming too indispensable. In the end, their wealth proved deadlier than any Saracen blade, and their legacy, it slumbers beneath modern finance and folklore, from the birth of banking to those whispered rumors of hidden treasure. Fact 30. The betrayal that shattered the Templars, and why we still can't look away. The smoke had barely cleared from the last Templar's execution when the whispers began. How had Europe's most powerful warrior monks, men who once commanded castles, banks, and even kings, been brought to their knees by the very rulers they served? The truth was colder than a dungeon floor. The Templars weren't destroyed by foreign enemies, but by their own king's greed. In one brutal October dawn in 1307, Philip Roman IV of France ordered every Templar in his realm arrested simultaneously, a medieval sting operation fueled by fabricated charges of heresy, blasphemy, and even devil worship. Under torture, knights who'd faced Saracen armies without flinch confessed to absurd crimes, spitting on crosses, worshipping a mysterious idol named Baphomet, engaging in forbidden rituals. Their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, retracted his confession too late. He was burned alive on a Parisian island, his dying curse allegedly haunting the French monarchy for generations. The Templars' vast wealth seized overnight, their estates redistributed to royal cronies under the thin guise of religious reform. Yet the tragedy wasn't just in their fall, it was in what it revealed about power. These weren't rogue warlords cut down for tyranny. They were loyal servants sacrificed to settle royal debts and consolidate control. A knight's greatest threat, it turned out, wasn't a sword from the front but a dagger in the back from his own liege. Why knights still captivate us centuries later, their allure hasn't faded. Maybe it's the contradictions how these men could be both brutal warlords and romantic icons, both pious crusaders and cunning politicians. They represent an era when honor and ambition clashed violently, when a single lifetime could span blood-soaked battlefields and glittering courts. We see ourselves in their flaws, their vanity, their courage, their desperate grasp at legacy. Or perhaps it's simpler. In a world of algorithms and grey morality, knights offer something we crave, clear lines between hero and villain, even if history painted them in shades of betrayal. Their armor gleams in museums not because it was perfect, but because it was human, dented by choices, scarred by compromises, yet still standing. That's why we keep polishing their myths. Not to remember who they were, but to ask who we might become. And with that, the final page turns, but the legend, like the knights themselves, refuses to die. Final segment, the knight's lasting shadow, why their truth matters more than myth. Strip away the gilded legends, and what remains isn't just a warrior, it's a mirror. The medieval knight's life was a paradox of blood and beauty, where the same hands that penned love poetry could strangle a rival in the mud. They weren't born heroes or villains, but men shaped by an era that demanded both ruthlessness and refinement. For every shining act of chivalry, there's a ledger entry for stolen grain. For every grand tournament victory, a whispered confession of corruption. Yet their contradictions make them unforgettable. These warriors built cathedrals and burned villages, worshipped saints and broke oaths, died for honor and sold their swords to the highest bidder. Perhaps that's why we can't let them go. In their flaws, we see our own struggles, the tension between ideals and survival, between who we are and who we pretend to be. So the next time you see a suit of armor in a museum, look closer. Those dents aren't just battle scars, they're the fingerprints of history, left by real men who were as human as they were legendary. Their world may be dust, but the questions they lived with still echo. When does duty become tyranny? Can violence ever be noble? And what will our armor look like to the people of the future? Now it's your turn. Which knightly truth left you rethinking everything? The battlefield hygiene horrors, the shameless ransom schemes, or the political betrayals? Slam your thoughts into the comments like a mace on a shield. And if you crave more unfiltered history, hit that subscribe button. The past is full of stories this wild, and we're just getting started. Until next time, fellow time travelers, may your curiosity stay sharper than a freshly whetted blade.